The battle for Kupiansk has reached its decisive conclusion, as Ukrainian forces aimed to break the last pockets of Russian resistance. The Russians were put under attack from all sides, and after months of brutal urban combat, the collapse of their last defensive positions was needed for Kupiansk to be finally free. With Ukrainians having already been very successful in their offensive, Russian forces attempted to re-establish a foothold through infiltration tactics. However, Ukrainian units had already locked down the main supply and access routes into the city, turning Kupiansk into a closed battlefield where any movement could be detected and targeted. Russian soldiers were forced to use improvised infiltration methods, including moving through empty underground pipelines. But as Russians had tried this several times before in this direction, the Ukrainians fully anticipated the action. Ambushes were prepared, and many of the infiltrating troops were eliminated before even reaching Kupiansk. Others, realizing the futility of their situation, chose to surrender rather than face certain death, as it became clear that no relief force was coming for the Russian soldiers that remained in Kupiansk. The final strongholds of Russian resistance were concentrated in the local hospital, the mechanical plant, and one of the schools in the city. Drone operators equipped with thermal imaging mapped enemy positions first, identifying concentrations of Russian troops and tracking their movements between buildings. Then, when Russian soldiers attempted to reposition into nearby high-rise buildings to engage Ukrainian ground lines of communication, Ukrainian assault groups were able to respond immediately and shut it down. FPV drones targeted basement positions, forcing defenders into exposed areas, while ground troops advanced with heavier explosives to neutralize resistance. This combination of aerial precision and ground assault trapped many Russian fighters inside, where they were either killed or captured. After securing the high-rise structures, Russians became fully isolated in their strongholds in the industrial and educational complexes as Ukrainians continued to advance. Fires were deliberately set to flush out entrenched defenders, creating chaos and forcing Russian troops into the open.
Systematic clearing operations conclude months-long Russian offensive, with Ukraine controlling key supply routes to Kramatorsk. Ukrainian forces are closing the gap around the remaining Russian forces in their Dobropilya salient. As Ukrainians finish off pockets of Russian resistance, the Russians' only hope is to surrender to the advancing Ukrainian army or be annihilated completely. After conducting a successful penetration from the high ground in the west, Ukrainians are now launching their attacks from the north as well, completing the pincer around the Russian Dobropilya salient. Ukrainians are using highly trained infantry squads to move in, engaging with Russian forces along the way. The main advantage of the Ukrainians here is their far superior ground lines of communication, enjoying a direct supply line from Kramatorsk and Ruzhivka, functioning as central operating hubs for Ukrainian forces in northern Donetsk. Additionally, if we take a look at the topographic map, we can see that as the Ukrainian supply lines approach the front, they cross through several settlements in the valley between two hills. This blocks signals for Russian drones, who mainly rely on FPV-type kamikaze drones instead of munitions dropped from drones. Russian fiber optics also still only makes up approximately 20% of FPVs used by the Russians, so the valley Ukrainians move through is largely protected against most Russian strikes. The buildings in the settlements and tree lines running along them offer additional concealment factors to Ukrainian infantry units passing through. The last major Ukrainian advantage is their extensive utilization of heavy drones like the Heavy Vampire and Baba Yaga variants. Because these drones drop heavy explosives or a series of smaller mortar rounds from a height, they are able to fly and hover above the valley, unaffected by the weaker signal strength that Russians suffer from lower to the ground. Geolocated footage shows how Ukrainian infantry squads move south through the settlements under the watchful eye and in constant communication with Mavic reconnaissance drones that detect any Russian presence. The Ukrainian squad initially engaged the position with grenade launchers, using high explosive rounds. However, the rounds were not penetrating into the basement, where some of the Russians were hiding. So to save manpower, ammunition, and time, a Vampire hexacopter drone was called in. The drone then dropped 4 mortar rounds directly on the basement, wiping out the structure and scoring several direct hits into the underground structure itself. Russian infantry attempting to flank Ukrainian attacks from the high ground to the east are also promptly intercepted by Ukrainian FPV drones patrolling the area, as signal strengths are much less disrupted on the high ground and the slopes that the Russians must move across first. In this manner, Ukrainians are systematically moving south, having already consolidated full control of Volodymyrivka and expanding the gray zone to fully encompass the Russian salient. As you remember from a previous report, Ukrainians avoided finishing off the 2 Russian encirclements further north to lure more Russian forces in to attempt to rescue them, while keeping them away from important positions. However, with the trap now sprung, there is little reason to keep these pockets alive, and the final clearing operations have begun. Ukrainian soldiers on the ground report that the western pocket has been cleared completely, as their attention is now moving to the one to the east. Every Russian is first offered surrender and to be taken as a prisoner of war. However, if they hold out and refuse, they are promptly dispatched. As Ukrainian forces are much needed elsewhere, and maintaining a tight perimeter costs a lot of resources. Overall, Ukrainians are closing the gates and finishing off any Russian soldiers who remain, as Ukrainian soldiers on the ground are already reporting that the prisoner of war exchange fund is rapidly being replenished. In the gray zone, Russian units moving through are now eliminated by drones, as Ukrainian infantry is making their way forward, leaving the fields covered in Russian bodies. The Russian Dobropilya breakthrough event is coming to a close, as many Russian generals will soon start shifting the blame to one another, as a hammer of consequences is sure to soon come from the direction of Moscow.